A political cartoon is signed opinion, unlike an editorial. And I don't think it should ever be subject to editorial direction. If a cartoonist needs editorial direction, then he is simply inadequate.
Those are the words of Pulitzer Prize winning cartoonist Bill Mauldin. For more than 50 years, he sought to capture the truth of American society and politics through pen and ink. From World War II to the fall of the Soviet Union, Mauldin used his artistry and wit to provide honest, sharp commentary on the world as he saw it, earning 2 Pulitzer Prizes in the process. He's best known for his military characters, Willie and Joe. Through them, he was able to capture the nuances of life in the Army, providing comic relief, while at the same time presenting the grim reality of the war to the home front. His wartime service also solidified his desire to expose and speak out against the inequalities he witnessed in the military and in society at large. Spurred on by a rebellious nature, Mauldin spent his career creating works he believed would make a difference, would have an impact. I'm Geoffrey Baer, here at the Pritzker Military Museum and Library in Chicago, where we're going to take a look at a new exhibit about a legendary political cartoonist with deep ties to this city. Drawn to Combat, Bill Mauldin and the Art of War. The PMML is the repository of the largest collection of Mauldin's work, so it's a fitting place to host a landmark exhibition about him. Let's explore it and learn about his 50-year career as a cartoonist.
A cartoonist can't really be for somebody. Ours is essentially a destructive art. We are not pontificators or molders of thought, or at least we shouldn't try to be. Ours is more the role of the lowly gadfly. Circle and stab, circle and stab. Roughly put, our credo should be, if it's big, hit it.
Bill Mauldin dreamed of being a cartoonist for as long as he could remember. He quipped that he could draw before he could talk. It might seem like a far-fetched ambition for a child growing up in the rural Southwest during the Great Depression, but Mauldin was tenacious, seeking out cartooning opportunities wherever he found them. He drew cartoons for his school newspaper. He even painted signs for local businesses. Perhaps his biggest period of growth occurred during a single year from July 1939 to July 1940, when he moved here to Chicago to attend the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts. Not long after he began his studies, he wrote to his grandmother about some classwork he particularly enjoyed.
Monday, I did a proportion in the morning and sketches from the model in the afternoon. Wow. I thought she'd use drapes, but no. When I looked up, there she stood, all decked out in her birthday suit. Nana, don't you dare write to the Academy and demand they use drapes on their models. I enjoy it. And seriously, it is a wonderful study of anatomy. I've improved noticeably in just 2 days.
After just a year of formal training, Mauldin's work had improved dramatically. During his time at the Academy of Fine Arts, he estimated he had submitted more than 400 drawings to numerous publications. He ultimately sold 24, published in Arizona Highways, Esquire, and the New York Times. He was 18 years old and had a rigorous work ethic, but it would take a world war to make the aspiring cartoonist famous. America's involvement in World War II wouldn't begin for another year. But the wheels were set in motion for Mauldin in 1940 when he returned to Arizona, ready for the next chapter of his career. He needed a source of income while he continued to pursue cartooning, so with a friend's encouragement, he joined the Arizona National Guard. The Army provided Mauldin with housing, clothing, and a paycheck, and even more importantly, material for his cartoons. Mauldin sketched as much as he could in his free time, and never one to pass up a captive audience. He showed his cartoons around Fort Sill. They were a hit with his fellow soldiers, and they caught the attention of the top brass, as he outlines in this letter home in the fall of 1940.
Reported to Colonel Harrison last night. And who should be sitting in the tent but the commanding general of the 45th Division. The colonel introduced me to the general and told me to sit down, which I did, a trifle nervously. We had a nice long gab fest, and the general looked through my scrapbook while I talked to the colonel. The general seemed to think I had something. The general had seen the book the night before, and it ended that I got a 3-column space for a regular feature in the division newspaper, and I would be given a place to work in at division headquarters.
Training with his infantry company provided Mauldin with more than enough material for his cartoons in the 45th Division News, and he found that the more they were based on the company's experiences, the more his fellow soldiers loved his work.
Take a look at it, you could almost with soft focus see where the focus of the paint of the drawing is, and you could see, just the direction, all the lines, the way they all point to the center, which is where you should end up. Yep. But before you get to the center, you do kind of check out this guy running in the background and the airplane, and you know how Mauldin loved to draw machines and any equipment or weapons. He drew with high fidelity to all those things. And you get to see all of that, the packs, the attention to detail and everything. There's so much going on. What could possibly distract these men from their training?
Yes, exactly.
There's almost one thing and one thing only, and that is a piece of mail.
Mail call, yeah. One of the things that to me is striking about this is he just crammed it all together when naturally this would not, you wouldn't have an airplane next to a tank with all these guys, fully kitted up depending on what they're doing. And then the caption is, "No news fella, just garden beautiful, asking if I want to renew my subscription." The punch that you get from this cartoon, it's hilarious.
It's a sight gag as much as anything else, but it's also a historically important commentary, I think, on what infantry soldiers and all soldiers, sailors, Marines probably valued most when they were overseas or away from home. It was mail. Mail was a lifeline. Back home, that's how important it was. And it's a wonderful, funny little commentary on a really basic part of Army life.
By early 1943, Bill Mauldin had spent more than 2 years developing his cartoon series, Star-Spangled Banter, which would become the foundation for his cartoons in Europe. Mauldin traveled with the 45th Division overseas as the unit prepared for the invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943. Moving north through Sicily and later Italy, Mauldin captured scenes of American soldiers suffering through the hardships and realities of war, transforming his peacetime soldiers into war-weary veterans. Mauldin's observations would solidify his 2 most important characters, Willie and Joe. When Willie and Joe suffered through foul weather, miserable chow, or rear echelon bureaucracy, it was because Mauldin had seen American fighting men endure those same conditions.
I think the interesting thing, if you look at these guys, Dad exaggerated it a little, but only a little, like, maybe the tear and the splotch and all the rest of that. But one of the things about these guys is that they always look the same. And Patton may have wanted everybody to be in the shaving mirror every morning and to make sure everything was right and straight and everything, but this is how they looked. This is how everybody looked when they were there. And I think this was his way of showing this is a normal infantryman dressed normally, doing normal stuff, and everybody here who would see them would think, oh my God, the guy was on a bender for 3 straight weeks, right? But no, this was their life. He did not talk about them very much when I was a little kid. He didn't. Okay. And I think part of that may have had to do with the fact that I know that, he talked about killing them at the end of the war, and how every editor, everybody said, you do it, we're not going to print it, period. And so he was sort of pushed into their next life. And I think that there was some material from that next life which was actually great because he loved these guys and they were great, but it didn't end well for him. He didn't like that. And in a lot of ways, I think what he said, I wish I had in retrospect. So 2 of the greatest characters ever, that's all I can say.
Throughout his 50-year career, Mauldin would draw inspiration from his World War II experiences. He would cover all the major U.S. military conflicts, visiting troops during the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and in 1990, traveling to Saudi Arabia as the U.S. troops prepared for Operation Desert Storm. never losing sight of his intention to bring to life the experiences of the citizen soldier, highlighting the connections and similarities of soldiers throughout history. As Mauldin saw it, a soldier's life consisted of being cold, wet, dirty, and hungry, punctuated by moments of terror and absurdity that would disillusion even the most motivated soldier. He also knew that the dull, monotonous moments of life in the Army were perhaps the most relatable experiences for any service member. For an infantryman, rain was a scourge. Hunkered down in a foxhole amid the shelling and machine gun fire, the rain and other poor weather only made the situation that much more unbearable. In this cartoon, set during the Vietnam War, the heat, humidity, and rainfall of the jungle make conditions miserable for two combat soldiers. As they sit waiting in the mud, trying to light a cigarette, one asks the other, "And what made you choose my brand? The extra length or the mildness?" It's classic foxhole humor. The soldier jokes about choice in a situation where choice is impossible, and weather makes smoking nearly impossible as well. It's not only the misery of the situation, but also the fact that there's nowhere for them to go, no way out, and no choices. It also speaks to the inventive, often absurd conversations that soldiers use to fill these moments in war. By illustrating the ins and outs of Army life, Mauldin often found himself walking a fine line between humorous gags and insubordination. His cartoons from World War II mocked officers for their haughty nature and condescending attitudes, because he witnessed many who abused their power. This cartoon is typical of Mauldin's general contempt toward officers. It depicts an officer telling his sergeant to requisition a fire. It's a ludicrous idea that makes you laugh, and then you stop and think about it. Requisition is a nice clean word for steal. Whose fire is it? Is it a civilian's, a soldier's? It's irrelevant to the officer. He doesn't care. It's about his comfort. In just a few words and a drawing, he tells us how he views officers. Selfish, demanding, domineering, caring more about spit and polish and following the bureaucracy of the Army. And he used his cartoons to hold them accountable, to call out their failures of leadership, while getting a few laughs in the process. But Mauldin didn't hate all officers. He also depicted those who lived with their men, fought with them, and cared about their comfort, sanity, well-being, and above all else, their mission.
I, as an officer, definitely am very mindful when I read all of his cartoons that he basically made his living making fun of officers. The cartoon is, "Don't mention it, Lieutenant, they might have replaced you with one of them saluting demons." He's walking across a great battlefield. I take very seriously the cautions against authoritarianism and entitlement. I don't think that I've ever veered into those lanes, but I definitely read his book occasionally. I have it in my office of Up Front, just as a reminder of the perspective of the enlisted and how particularly apt just sort of the feel that he evokes is still today in the infantry.
Coming home from World War II held both triumph and trials for Mauldin. With his cartoons appearing in more than 200 stateside newspapers, a Pulitzer Prize to his name, and a book set to be published, the war had made his career. Shortly after his homecoming, Bill found himself inundated with requests for work, including a movie deal promising to put Willie and Joe on the silver screen. But he struggled to fit in at home, and he saw those struggles in his fellow veterans. You can see this reflected in Mauldin's work as Willie and Joe's struggles.
There were problems as after every war, but during World War II, when we had 16 million in uniform being demobilized all at once, there were inevitably problems, but there was real concern about how these former soldiers who had been living in mud for months, if not years, how are they going to become civilized again? How are they going to become domesticated again? It's almost as if the media, the newspapers, were primed for these problems, and that's kind of, and as American citizens back home, were primed to read and hear about troubled veterans, as I think they are today, And so here is the wife reading the Daily Dirt, which is a newspaper. Veteran kicks aunt is the headline. Jealous vet sees judge, So, very minor veteran stories. When Mauldin returned home from World War II, he didn't like the label of veteran. He didn't really self-identify as a veteran. He wanted to learn how to be a citizen. That was his thing. And he thought that there was too much attention focused on troubled veterans and reintegrating veterans. So I think this cartoon really captures it. But if something happened in the news, if there was a crime, it was only news if a veteran did it. Most of these cartoons, you laugh when you first get the gag, and then you reflect just a little bit and you realize this isn't funny. This is tragic.
Bill Mauldin became famous for his illustrations of combat infantrymen. But it was his political cartoons that would cement his reputation as one of the most important cartoonists of the 20th century. His cartoons made instant impressions. Like the best political commentary, his work was always grounded in truth. Filtering complex political issues into a single scathing image, Mauldin's illustrations addressed the most important political topics of the day and imprinted his viewpoint into the national consciousness. Remarkably, even people ridiculed by Mauldin's pen would often admit that he got it right, and sometimes even ask for the original drawing. These works, dating from as early as 1945, show that when he returned from World War II, Mauldin immediately began addressing the racism he saw in the Army and in civilian society. Some of his earliest post-war political cartoons addressed minorities in uniform, including some Japanese American veterans who were literally spat on and treated like the enemy. Mauldin had seen the valor of the Japanese American 442nd Infantry Regiment firsthand as they fought in Europe, and he was incensed that they would be treated with such disdain. The issues that Mauldin first viewed through the experiences of veterans began to take on a broader realm when he realized that the injustices and inequities that existed for minority service members extended to how those communities were treated by the larger society. As his work garnered more and more attention in the press, Mauldin became emboldened to speak out for disaffected groups and against policies he saw infecting American politics.
I was immediately drawn to this because I went, I'm the model. And I remember well when this cartoon came out, and I appreciated how he managed to get two civil rights issues in one cartoon, and particularly that he tackled the issue of gay rights at that time was pretty early on, as often was the case with Bill. Anybody's rights that are denied, it's the same thing. And I'm reminded of someone in reference to the Holocaust said, first they came for going through the list of all the groups, and I didn't stand up. And finally they came for me, and there was no one left to stand up for me. So he was well aware of how it's all connected.
He often did rich man, poor man scenes, two rich man and a poor man sitting on a park bench, or he did a few of a poor man walking up to a limousine, which is what we're looking at here. And so here we have somebody, a beggar on the street, asking the person sitting in the back of the limousine, trickle down. And trickle down, that was a nickname for trickle down economics that President Reagan's economic advisor, David Stockman, came up with. The idea was that if you cut taxes on the rich, if you kind of deregulate corporations, that the money that will be saved at the top will trickle down to employees at the bottom. And Mauldin didn't know economics. I mean, he was a very smart perceptive commentator, but nothing was off limits. So often his cartoons are just like his immediate reaction, his sense of skepticism. Like, wait a minute, how is this supposed to work? And I think that's captured here. You know? Even visually you can see it. Here is, Mauldin may have faxed this from Santa Fe to Chicago, which is why you see these bold black lines. But visually, there's a kind of a contrast here. This man, the street man has a shadow. He's grayed in. He has the wrinkles like Willie and Joe have wrinkles. There's something authentic and tactile about him. He's a real person, whereas this is just like a monolith. Yep. It's a block that isn't shaded in. And so you get that contrast and that tension visually, even when you don't understand what the tension is about. It's just this is a masterful composition.
So looking at this piece here, we've got President Ronald Reagan up here in USS Reagan. We've got the iceberg, and he is blasting away at the drug problem, while we've got, of course, the larger social problems, under the water. What is your take on this piece?
Well, the first thing I notice is that it's as old as me, which is wild because you could just make it about today. Just erase the 1986 and put 2021, and it would totally be accurate, because everyone's attacking the tip of the iceberg, the symptom, but ignoring the problem of why everyone is wanting to do drugs all the time. Well, and I think that's why so much of his work is so timeless, is because he would always go for something larger than the symptom. He would always go for the source, and he was one of those guys who was asking, like, why? Why are we doing this, et cetera, et cetera. And this is just a great illustration of that. And it's also just wild to look at, because this just theme of the tip of the iceberg and then the rest of it, you see this in memes all the time now. People will just take a photograph of an iceberg and put their own captions on it. Yeah. So it's just fascinating to me as well that in 1986 he was doing cartoons that were still now using the same format,
In 1990, Mauldin visited U.S. service members preparing for the assault on Kuwait and Iraq. The trip was familiar for the old soldier, who had never hesitated to find ways to personally experience what American troops in combat were going through, and to express that to the public through his work. However, nearly 50 years since his own service, most troops didn't know who the old cartoonist was. Nevertheless, he went there because he thought that if soldiers' lives were going to be on the line, it should be for a good reason. To make his point, he returned to sketching his famous characters, Willie and Joe. Like Mauldin himself, Willie and Joe are older now, jaded and skeptical that anything is ever going to be decided in the common soldier's best interest. They've lived through World War II, Korea, Vietnam. They've seen the outcome of American involvement in Central America and the Middle East. Mauldin himself had traveled to the Middle East several times in the 60s and 70s, and he believed that the coming war in Kuwait and Iraq was about optics and political maneuvering. This cartoon sums that up. As a reflection of Bill Mauldin's career, we'll leave you with what many believe to be his most memorable cartoon.
This might be Bill Mauldin's most famous cartoon. It might be, and it was done on November 22nd, 1963. Mauldin was at a Council of Foreign Relations meeting at the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago when somebody came to the microphone and said the president has been shot. The recommendation was that everybody should go home. Mauldin instead went to the Sun-Times. Even though it was his day off, he was determined that he would get a cartoon out about this. And of course, he knew nothing about the context of the assassination. He knew nothing about what might come of this tragedy that had just struck the country, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. But he knew Kennedy, he had covered him a lot. He knew tragedy, it was deep inside his soul. And so he knew somehow that he had to get across what he was feeling and what he imagined the country was feeling, without any kind of political commentary, without fear-mongering. He thought maybe it was Kennedy's civil rights position that had attracted the assassin. That made him think of Lincoln, the prior assassinated president. That made him think of the Lincoln Memorial. The whole time he's watching the clock, He goes down to the engraver at the Sun-Times and says, "How much time do I have?" And the engraver said, like, "If you get it to me in the next couple hours, I can get it done." Usually, I mean, it took a full day, 8 hours, just to finish the cartoon, let alone come up with the idea. He came up with the concept of Lincoln on the memorial, and this is the drawing. But he did get it finished very quickly, sprayed it with fixative, ran it down to the engraver, who was able to produce this on the back of the Chicago Sun-Times, which was a tabloid, the full back cover. The engraver immediately noticed that this was a masterpiece and made the decision on his own to make sure that it was going to be on the back cover. And over the next day, the Sun-Times, when it was sold on the streets here in Chicago, instead of the headline being displayed at the newsstands, the reverse side, Mauldin's cartoon, was displayed. All people saw was just this, no words. And I think that's important. I think that's what makes this is his most famous cartoon, but I think it's representative in a way of what Mauldin was always trying to achieve. He said his goal always was to do a cartoon with no caption, no words. If you could get it done in an image, if you could make your statement in an image, then it was the pinnacle of success when it came to cartooning. He did it with this one.
After more than 50 years behind a drawing board, Bill Mauldin finally retired. Not long after that, he severely injured his drawing hand while working on his Jeep, ruling out any possibility of a return to cartooning and making it difficult for Mauldin to continue illustrating at all. His health declined over the next 10 years. He was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease in the late 1990s and died in 2003. He was 81 years old. Bill Mauldin's immeasurable impact on people's lives can be seen in the thousands of friends and fans who wished him well and comforted him in his last days, and in the young men and women he inspired to become cartoonists. They've sought to emulate Mauldin in both the civilian world and the military and engage their audiences with the same effective, hard-hitting illustrations that take on complicated topics with finesse and humor. Mauldin's images continue to be relevant today, and he's widely considered one of the most important cartoonists of the 20th century. There are thousands more Mauldin cartoons here in the Pritzker Military Museum and Library's collections and in the publications that gather together Mauldin's works. Has this tour sparked your interest to seek out more of Mauldin's work? If so, you'll find much more in these resources that will make you laugh, or as Mauldin would hope, think. What you do next is up to you.